Are you an Uruk-hai warrior? Were you pulled out of the ground one day, handed one of these swords, and sent off into battle without a clue how to use it? Are you sick of seeing you and your friends being easily defeated by a lone hero who's been separated from his party, and who's easily wading through waves of your forces? Or maybe you're just a Lord of the Rings enthusiast who's interested to see how a weapon like this would have functioned in the real world, or how you can use it to defeat opponents similar to the Knights of Gondor or the Rohirrim. Well, stick around. I'm going to show you how we can apply real-world historical European martial arts techniques to this weapon, using the officially licensed Lord of the Rings Uruk-hai Scimitar, and theorizing how it could be used in time periods seen in the Lord of the Rings movies, or in the real-world late medieval period.
Oh, no, Jesus.
So first off, forgive me for my nasally voice. I was afflicted by an undesirable status effect by some goblins in my homestead. So according to the Lord of the Rings Weapons of Warfare, the official illustrated guide to the battles, arms, and armies of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, this sword is described as a brutal one-handed falchion resembling a meat cleaver. The weapon's design was meant for mass production. According to this guide, the Uruk-hai were not trained how to use it, and it's mentioned that the only thing required is a great amount of strength because of the amount of metal in it. Now, according to this sword is supposed to weigh about 10 pounds. This replica weighs about 3.3 pounds. Since humans aren't as strong as Uruk-hai, we can just assume that the disparity in weight between the replica and the sword's description is equal to the disparity between humans and Uruk-hai, right? So the sword is classified a few ways officially. It's called a sword, it's called a falchion, it's called a scimitar. In my opinion, it doesn't have the qualifications to be called any of those things. Personally, I think it's closer to a machete, but kind of the way a bear is closely related to a raccoon. Now, a machete-like instrument is definitely useful for a fighting force that probably uses a lot of guerrilla warfare. It would be useful to clear out brush. However, as you can see, this thing is much bigger than your standard modern machete. Now, machetes are very lightweight. This is not. It weighs more than 3 times as much as this machete, and it's obviously much longer, though still very short for something you would call a sword. Much shorter than this pretty standard-sized katana, which is already considered pretty short for a sword. The blade is much thicker at the spine compared to a machete, though still it's a pretty flat blade. The grip is long enough for two-handed use, which is not the same as a machete, but far less than the katana. Much like the machete, there is no hand protection, except for a very slight overbite on the blade, which kind of covers your index finger a little bit. The blade is full tang, which actually protrudes out of the bottom of the grip, and there is absolutely no counterbalance to this, making it an extremely forward-weighted weapon. Not having some sort of guard or sword catching or stopping implement kind of disqualifies it from being classified as a sword, in my opinion, and makes it very dangerous to use in a crossing or a bind. Even a langsmesser, which is similarly sized and weighted, even though it has very small protrusions to protect your hands, it allows you to perform various sword catches and counters, which the orc sword simply can't do safely. So this weapon, while it doesn't have a long grip, can be used comfortably in 2 hands. Its overall reach, at just under 32 inches, it's really short for a 2-handed weapon. It does have a kind of weird edged corner at the top, which I guess can be used for some kind of very weak thrust. The real star of the show on this weapon is this spike on the back. This thing is disgusting. And my only real regret is the fact that it's on the back and not the front. I personally think that the spike should be on the front with the blade on the inside, much like a kora, which is a far weirder weapon than the Uruk-hai sword that was actually used in Nepal and North India, which has a similar balance, weight, and length, but is more suited to one-handed use. Another similar weapon with the spike on the front is the Native American gunstock war club. This one doesn't have a blade, but it has the weight. While this thing is more of a club by design, that spike on the front does a lot of damage. There's another obvious downside to having the spike on the back, and that's that it will generally be facing you if the blade is facing your opponent. If another weapon hits your weapon, on the edge, it might drive the spike back towards you, which got close enough to me while I was using this thing to make my life flash before my eyes a couple times. Not to mention, while swinging the weapon behind you, if you're not aware of where the spike is at, there is some potential that you could stab yourself in the back. And turning your blade into this hanging position can be really risky without practice, as the spike is kind of going right towards your face. But yeah, while there's nothing remarkable about the blade at all, the spike on the back has a lot of utility. When it fully penetrates a target, it leaves an absolutely horrifying gash. Now, it's debatable based on its shape whether it could dependably break through chainmail. I don't think it could penetrate a breastplate, but it did bite into my breastplate a little bit here, which was kind of interesting. I do think the spike would bend or break before it would do any significant damage to plate armor. What it's really good for is getting in between the gaps and hooking and locking into different parts of the plate mail. The spike is actually flat enough that it can actually fit in between the tight plates on the elbow here. If the spike of this weapon was on the front, it'd be much easier to implement half-swording techniques at close range against heavily armored opponents so that you can thrust the spike into the gaps in the armor much more easily. And at that close range, the length of this blade wouldn't actually be a hindrance, it would actually be a benefit, because shorter weapons can work much easier at close range. Where I think this weapon really shines is working in conjunction with a shield and against lightly armored opponents who also have shields. There's a lot of utility, especially with this spike, working with the shield to lock and stop spears, for example. If the spike was on the front with the blade on the inside, this would also double as a chopping action, allowing the weapon to bite into the spear and making it much easier to lock it in. The spike also allows you to attack somebody over their shield. Or if you're fast enough, you can pull your opponent's shield down, attack in between the shield with your own, allowing you to topple your opponent or cover yourself while you drop the spike overhead. You can also use the spike to attack the back of your opponent's legs, which is less armored usually, or hook their legs behind their knee, giving you the ability to take them down. But yeah, like I mentioned before, officially the orcs have no training with this weapon whatsoever. And it shows in the choreography. If you watch all three movies, I don't think you'll see the orcs do any other kind of attack other than a downward attack from on high. I think every single orc does this same attack over and over and over again. And I don't think the spike gets used a single time in any of the Lord of the Rings movies by any of the Uruk-hai. So for a historical European fighting style that I would adapt to this weapon, I would take a lot from Joachim Meyer's Dussack. Now the Dussack is mostly a training weapon. While it's made of leather and wood and is much, much lighter than the Uruk-hai Sword or scimitar, whatever you want to call it, it is a slashing fighting style that takes into account that there is no guard or sword stopping implement. There's no techniques that necessarily require you to catch an opponent's weapon incoming. There are big flourishes such as the plunging cut, using its heavy forward momentum and carrying it through to the next attack. I think it's best to use the Uruk-hai shield as your defense. The Uruk-hai shield doesn't behave like a buckler or a round center grip shield, but there are some sword and shield techniques that you can mix in there with it. I would simply cut at open quadrants around the shield. This is kind of how I tend to fight with Viking Age weapons. You don't really see too many opportunities to defend with the sword when your opponent is always trying to get at the part of your body that your shield isn't covering. Now that is unless, of course, your opponent is heavily armored, such as the Knights of Gondor or Knights in real life. In that case, you're definitely going to adapt some kind of half-sorting techniques, and that's all going to become about driving that spike into the gaps of the armor like we covered before. You can also use this weapon to perform various grappling techniques that are performed from half-sword positions or similar to the ones that you see in Langsmesser manuals, such as the Kushner. So, I hope this was useful. Obviously, my goal here is to teach historical European martial arts through the lens of fantasy, which is always fun to do. So go now, my little Uruk-hais. You do not know pain, you do not know fear. Taste man flesh or something. But more importantly, fight like you know what you're doing. If you want to support me, like and subscribe. Check my links down below. Let me know if you want to see more like this. Until next time.